So I'm here with Daniel Saucier. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre de Formation Médicale de Nouveau-Brunswick in Moncton. Thanks for joining the NB Media Club today.
I'm glad to be here to chat. Thank you.
Now, you recently told a legislative committee about your research showing a link between pollutants such as sulfur dioxide and, if I've got this right, the neurodegenerative disease ALS in New Brunswick. Can you break this down for me?
Most certainly. So indeed, as you mentioned, my studies had to do with the neurological condition known as ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Some people know it from the name Lou Gehrig's disease, from the famous baseball player that had it, or, certain fundraising campaigns that have arrived in the past, like the famous Ice Bucket Challenge. So it is indeed that disease. And during my doctoral studies, we decided to look at what environmental pollutants may or may not be linked to what was a perceived increase of ALS cases in the province, something that had been signaled to our clinicians by many people with lived experience of ALS and their families. And as you mentioned, one of the facets we looked at was air pollutants, and sulfur dioxide ended up being one that we noticed a significant association, where those that seem to be exposed to increased levels of this pollutant, there was greater odds of someone being diagnosed, or at least the onset of the ALS.
And so how do you measure this kind of thing? How do you go about, what's the method?
So measuring something like this can be kind of hard to do. As you can imagine, we don't necessarily have a weather monitor station in everyone's backyard. What we do have, though, is monitoring stations that exist throughout the province. And there is the Canoe Consortium, which is a consortium that houses a bunch of databases. And they happen to have, with scientists who have published studies, models that are able to consider, industrial influence in the area, weather patterns, spectral measurements from satellites. And then they can kind of, make really good estimates of what pollution levels might look at individual postal codes the further you stray away from these monitoring stations. So we were able to have access to this data that gave great estimates on these measurements at approximately a postal code level or within a kilometer or so.
Okay, wow. So and based on that, you're able to tell more or less how much of a certain pollutant is present in the air in that postal code.
Exactly. These databases, what they allow us to do is look at approximately what we would estimate based on these models pollution looks like in these areas. As you can imagine, some have different variants of spatial resolutions, as some pollutants can travel very far. So sulfur dioxide and ozone tend to be more like a 10 to 20 kilometer spatial resolution, just based on their nature to travel very, very far. But we were still able to make sure that, okay, for this resolution, what postal codes are found in that area, and then assign based on that estimate to an individual's, residential history.
So sulfur dioxide and ozone can travel relatively far in significant concentrations.
So it can travel very far, and indeed, I'm glad you mentioned about concentration. Obviously, the more that is released, the more opportunity that as it spreads. You can imagine the further you get, the concentration's kind of diluted in the sense that the wind is blowing it elsewhere. The higher the initial measure is, you would still expect that said measurements would be found elsewhere further along, especially if you're like in a downwind situation.
And so then you take this information and you compare it to cases of ALS as they're distributed across the province. Is that right?
So we take these geospatial measurements that we're able to have on these pollutants, and basically we do the resident history that we had available thanks to the NB Citizen database. We were able to take these cases, put them into the data center known as NBRDT. There's a satellite campus here at Moncton, in addition to their main campus being located at the University of New Brunswick. And basically with that, we're able to see for example, if they were diagnosed in 2016, what their levels look at 2 years before that, 3 years before that, 4 years, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way until we have no more residential history information on them. We then also take, for every one ALS case, we take 4 controls. And in this case, it was 4 people that from this MB Citizen database, which is like everyone who's been issued an MB Medicare card, we take people that don't have motor neuron disease according to their diagnosis codes. And we do the same homework. Okay, if we matched you to a case based on, hey, you were born on the same year and you're the same sex, 2 years relative before the diagnosis of your match case, what were pollution levels like at your house? 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, until we have no more information available on those individuals. For each case, you now have like 4 people you're comparing to. And then on top of that, you can take the whole population, do your averages and whatnot, and be like, okay, for ALS cases in New Brunswick, these are the levels we saw for pollutants. Okay, for all the controls that we took, these are what levels we're looking at. Are they significantly higher in the ALS cases, yes or no?
What conclusions can you draw from this research?
So the conclusions we can draw from this research is, one, that there is indeed a link and an association between increased sulfur dioxide exposure and the odds of having ALS. We don't check all the causality boxes. This is only one study at the end of the day to say this is a formal causal link, but we do meet some of those check marks. So there's at least a correlation and some evidence to suggest causal link. We can also get from these results that this was noted despite levels of sulfur dioxide being, for most of the population in Brunswick, under what would be considered, the management levels we seek to have based on Canadian standards. So that hints at, again, based on what other studies on low pollution, I put that in brackets because what is really low pollution, can still potentially have detrimental effects for our health. So it kind of reflects, again, that the standards we have right now just reflect the current levels of pollution we're living in. And as norms become more stricter, we're going to be able to study whether or not there's still adverse health effects for us at these lower levels. There's still a preliminary analysis that was done by Dr. O'Connell's team on the cases from 2003 to 2013 that looked where were people living when they got the diagnosis. And indeed, Bathurst was the biggest cluster. And it is interesting to note, without mentioning the specific industries, sulfur dioxide, at least in New Brunswick, the biggest sources from an industrial standpoint are those that do energy production, mining, a lot of fabrication. And it just so happens that Beldoon, which is, a little bit of a drive from Bathurst, happens to have the number 1 and the number 2 emitters, number 2 before it closed down. The smelter, indeed, right. But, for sulfur dioxide emissions. So the next step would be to take the study we've done and then just isolate to the cases of Bathurst and see, okay, what are the levels of sulfur dioxide just for this suspected cluster? And then see, are those levels even higher than just ALS cases in general in New Brunswick?
Can you run that part by me again? So
yeah.
we know that Beldoon has a coal burning electric generating station, the Beldoon power station, and that it had until very recently this smelter, Glencore smelter. Now you take that information, you know that people in that area, you know that there's no dispute, I think, from what you've told me, that there is a relatively high number of people with ALS in that area, in Bathurst, correct?
According to the spatial analysis, there is indeed a relatively higher number. It'll be interesting to see that based on now that we have cases not just up till 2013, but now all the way up to 2020, thanks to the study. We included all the way up to 2020 for the entire study. Will that cluster still show up with the addition of new cases? And if it does, it's exactly that. Our levels of sulfur dioxide, because again, this was just like for the whole province, the environmental study. If we focus on the cases from Bathurst, will we see those levels be even considered significantly more higher than the general ALS person across New Brunswick? We're almost asking 2 questions here. And the first question was answered with the environmental study, where it was, is increased sulfur dioxide, among the pollutants we studied, related to an increased odds of ALS. By doing the cluster, it's almost now like, okay, for areas that are considered maybe a potential hotspot, so levels that are even higher, does it even higher level of exposure, if there is indeed one in the area, mean even more cases. So not just odds of ALS, but odds of excess cases existing in your area to the point of being considered a hotspot. So it's really trying to fine tune that question of, is it not only related to ALS, but is it related to ALS hotspots? Has there been any other evidence that's seen a link between sulfur dioxide and ALS? So far, not directly. There's been some mention of, diesel exhaust exposure being quite related to ALS in numerous studies. And anything that does combustion can have a certain quantity of evidently nitrogen dioxide, which is more pollutant that's been seen in the literature so far for ALS. But before we had low sulfur diesel, you can imagine sulfur dioxide happened to be quite a bit higher in that diesel combustion. Whether it's a breakthrough or not, I think we can't get to that point yet, seeing as this still remains just one study. It's still very pertinent in the aspect that it's done in our own backyard, so people should be aware of this and be informed. I would love to see the study redone in another province or another area that happens to have high sulfur dioxide exposure. And if we saw that again, that would be really telling then. That would really show that, okay, it's not just based on our context. It would also check off some more causality boxes, which you would expect to see it happening in other areas as well, too, these associations being found.
Right.
And at the end of the day, as much as this is interesting, that yes, we have shown a link between sulfur dioxide and ALS, it remains that it's not the sole thing that would be causing the disease. This disease is similar to cancer. A multi-step process has been hypothesized. You kind of need like 6 things to kind of happen or go wrong with your metabolic pathways. You would need like a certain like genetic predisposition and then maybe like 1 or 2 environmental exposures. Or if you don't have any genetic predisposition, maybe you need like 4 or 5 different environmental exposures. So it might not be like the only culprit. It may be just a question of maybe this is what broke the camel's back at the end of the day.
Yeah, so there might be, if you're someone who's predisposed to ALS, living in the vicinity of a mill or a power plant might be something that catalyzes that.
In the field, there's in the model that the pros, they almost say like it's almost like a trigger event, you could say. So it's indeed, usually you might have someone who either has a genetic predisposition or the other have some other possible or suspected risk factors. So maybe there was pesticide exposure, maybe there was military service history, maybe they smoked a bunch, stuff that's been at least on the level of a suspected risk factor, and then you add this on top of it. So then the question becomes almost like, if you withdraw that, would there at least be a delay until the next trigger occurs before the onset of symptoms occur?
I think Edmundston was also noted as a hotspot. Is that correct, or a cluster?
So according to the preliminary spatial analysis that was done on the case from 2002 to 2013, Edmundston was indeed another suspected potential hotspot area. And again, that would be one in particular that would be more interesting to see if it's still there after we add the new cases. Because that one, there was only actually a handful of cases there. And you know what happens with small numbers from time to time? You kind of get big changes in incident rates the smaller it is. It still doesn't neglect the fact that we found it to be kind of, staggering that there was still that many cases for such a small area. But having this longer period with the new data, it would be interesting to see like, okay, now we got a bigger time window at our disposal and we have more than a handful of cases. When we do all our adjustments, for example, the age of our population, do we still see that the stats are telling us chance can't explain this at all?
And of course, Edmundston is home to a mill. I noticed that you're reluctant, as at the legislative committee, to actually name the specific industries in these places. Why is that? Are you concerned about, I don't know, reflecting badly on them without enough evidence yet?
So as you can imagine, the environment in which we release stuff, it's kind of like a soup. A lot of stuff gets in there. It can spread very, very quickly everywhere, but it's going to be hard to find the exact origin of stuff as well, too. What we can say, though, is, and that's why we say it, we know what the main industry areas are and what are considered the biggest emitters of these pollutants. But yes, to go on to point the finger on one industry in particular, we would want to make sure that, we have more numbers to help back that up. So again, we can comment on, it's interesting to note that where there's a hot spot, you look not too far away and you got Belledune, you got the number 1 and formerly number 2 emitter of sulfur dioxide. But again, yes, we would want to see then, okay, but that was just levels across New Brunswick. We said that was higher at place of residence for people that had ALS. Let's look specifically at those people in Bathurst. Are they indeed, their ambient air pollution at their place of residence, is it even higher compared to the other ALS people across the province? If it was, then that gives us more meat to say, like, okay, we know there's emitters there, and we know that indeed that pollution has traveled, and according to the models that we used for the data, it's there. Then you can actually start, pointing towards the direction of, yes, these industries in particular by name would need to get their regulations up to snuff.
Right. And what are the other major questions that remain for you?
So, as mentioned, number 1 was redoing the spatial analysis that was done originally from 2003 to 2013 and include those cases up to 2020. See if those clusters still remain in the same spots. Number 2, if those clusters are still remaining, particularly the Bathurst one, are sulfur dioxide levels in Bathurst even higher compared to the rest of New Brunswick? And number 3, is there other environmental factors we're not considered in the area? Bathurst happens, I can imagine there would be quite a few people probably on well water. It might be interesting to see if we have access to any of that data and look in. And number 4, I'd be always interested to see, while it remains that most cases were sporadic in our population, if we ever did identify genetics in a subsample of our population, see how much, genetics predisposition, does it make, someone would be considered even more at risk for the damages of these pollutants. It takes a team to do this, so definitely thank all our co-collaborators that were on this as well too, the authors of the publication. The air pollution study on ALS has been published in Environmental Research, open access, so anyone is able to go read it, and you'll get all the nuances and finer details, which will help you to really appreciate the results. And other than that, it's like I mentioned that while we did find a link for ALS and sulfur dioxide, to still remember at the end of the day that it might not just be that alone that causes disease. It's likely a soup of other small contributions from all these other things that resulted at the end of the day. And studies like this help to see the environmental aspect, which is becoming, at least according to recent literature, seems to be actually playing a more and more maybe important role in the disease than we originally thought.